The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Bellini's, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. The warm glow of chandeliers reflected off polished silverware and crystal glasses, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that wealthy patrons paid handsomely to enjoy. Among the bustling staff moved Sophie Evans, a slender young woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements quick but graceful as she balanced plates and navigated between tables. Sophie had been working at Bellini's for just over 7 months. At 24, she was neither the youngest nor the most experienced server, but she had quickly earned respect from her coworkers for her reliability and calm demeanor even during the busiest rushes. What none of them knew was that every dollar she earned went toward a dream she'd been forced to put on hold. Table 12 needs their check, and 14 just got seated, called Raj, the floor manager, as Sophie passed by the service station. He barely looked up from the reservation book, his pen tapping impatiently. "And Mr. Rossi says the wine list for table 9 needs to go out now." "On it," Sophie replied, quickly grabbing the leather-bound wine menu. The weight of fatigue pulled at her shoulders. This was her 5th double shift this week, but she kept her posture straight and her expression pleasant. That's what the job required. That's what the tips required. Behind the scenes in the kitchen, pots clanged and chefs shouted orders while line cooks worked in choreographed chaos. Sophie slipped through, deftly avoiding a busboy carrying a stack of plates, and headed out to table 9. The noise of the kitchen faded behind her as she stepped back into the dining room, where soft piano music played through hidden speakers, and the gentle murmur of conversation created a backdrop of wealth and leisure. "Your wine list, sir," she said, placing it on the table with a practiced smile. The older gentleman nodded without looking up from his conversation. As Sophie turned to head toward table 14, she caught sight of the grand piano in the corner of the room. It sat silent tonight. Live music was only featured on weekends, but its polished surface gleamed under the lights, calling to her like an old friend. She allowed herself just a moment's glance before looking away. Some dreams had to wait. The hostess was seating a new party at table 14. 4 men in expensive suits, their confident postures and loud voices marking them as the type who were used to commanding rooms. Sophie recognized the restaurant's owner, Mr. Chen, personally escorting them, which meant they were VIPs, important clients, big spenders. "Sophie, this is Mr. Blackwell and his associates," Mr. Chen said as she approached. His tone was different than usual, more deferential. "They'll be your priority this evening." "Of course," Sophie nodded, taking in the group with a quick glance. 3 of the men barely acknowledged her, already deep in conversation about stock options and quarterly reports. But the 4th, seated at the head of the table, looked directly at her with sharp, assessing eyes. Richard Blackwell was probably in his 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and a tan that suggested recent travel. His watch alone probably cost more than Sophie's yearly tuition. "Welcome to Bellini's," she said with a warm smile. "Can I start you gentlemen with some drinks this evening?" "Macallan 25 neat," Blackwell said without looking at the menu. His companions followed with similarly expensive whiskey orders. Sophie nodded and turned to go when Blackwell added, "And bring the chef over. We won't be ordering from the regular menu." The request wasn't uncommon among VIPs, but the chef was in the middle of dinner service. "I'll let Chef Paolo know," Sophie said smoothly. "He's preparing several specials tonight that aren't on the menu." Did I stutter? Blackwell's voice cut through the ambient noise, causing nearby diners to glance over. "Tell Paolo that Richard is here. He knows me." Sophie kept her smile in place. "Of course, sir. Right away." As she walked to the bar to place the drink orders, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Men like Blackwell were common at Bellini's, people who measured their worth by how much control they could exert over others. She'd learned to navigate their moods and demands with practiced ease, but something about Blackwell's demeanor suggested this would be a challenging table. "Macallan 25. Times 4, she told Ben, the bartender. "Table 14. Ben raised his eyebrows. "Blackwell's back, huh?" "Good luck with that one." "You know him?" Sophie asked, lowering her voice. Ben nodded as he reached for the top-shelf bottle. "Comes in every few months. Big tipper if you kiss his ring, but he's made 3 servers cry that I know of." He poured the amber liquid with expert precision. "Just watch yourself." Sophie's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. She couldn't afford to pass this table to someone else. Not when high-end whiskey meant a higher bill and potentially bigger tips. Not when every dollar mattered. "Thanks for the warning," she said, arranging the drinks on her tray. When she returned to the table, Chef Paolo was already there, shaking hands with Blackwell and laughing as if they were old friends. The chef's presence had drawn attention from other diners. It wasn't often he emerged from the kitchen during service. "Ah, the drinks," Chef Paolo said as Sophie approached. "Perfect timing. Mr. Blackwell and his associates will have the tasting menu with the wine pairings. But start them with the truffle risotto I prepared this morning." "Yes, chef," Sophie replied, carefully distributing the whiskeys. "And make sure the sommelier knows it's for my table," Blackwell added, his tone making it clear he expected special treatment. As she placed the last glass down, Sophie's elbow was jostled by one of Blackwell's associates shifting in his chair. Water from the small glass she'd just refilled splashed onto the white tablecloth, a few drops landing on the sleeve of Blackwell's suit. The conversation stopped. "I'm so sorry, sir," Sophie said immediately, pulling out her serving cloth to dab at his sleeve. Blackwell held up his hand to stop her, his expression cold. "Don't bother." He looked at Chef Paolo with a tight smile. "Hard to find good help these days, isn't it?" The chef laughed uncomfortably. "Sophie is one of our best, actually. These things happen." But Blackwell was already dismissing her with a wave. "Just bring us fresh water. Try not to wear it this time." Heat rose to Sophie's cheeks as she heard muffled laughter from the table. She nodded and stepped away, maintaining her composure until she was safely behind the service station. There she took a deep breath, hands slightly shaking as she prepared a fresh pitcher of water. "You okay?" Raj asked, noticing her expression. "Fine," Sophie said, forcing a smile. "Just table 14 being difficult." Raj glanced over her shoulder at Blackwell's table and grimaced. "Mr. Chen says they get whatever they want tonight. Some big real estate deal in the works." He lowered his voice. "Just get through it. Your shift ends at 11, 6 more hours." Sophie squared her shoulders and picked up the water pitcher. She could handle difficult customers. She had been handling them since she started working at 16, taking any job she could find to save for music school. As the evening progressed, Blackwell's table grew louder with each round of drinks. Their laughter cut through the restaurant's refined atmosphere, drawing irritated glances from other diners. Sophie moved efficiently between their table and her others, bringing course after course of Chef Paolo's exquisite tasting menu. With each interaction, Blackwell seemed to take more notice of her, his comments becoming increasingly personal. "So what's a girl like you doing waiting tables?" he asked as she cleared their appetizer plates. "Couldn't find a rich husband?" His companion snickered, and Sophie felt her practiced smile strain at the edges. "Just paying my way through school, sir." "School? Let me guess, art history? Women's studies?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable. Sophie hesitated. She rarely shared personal details with customers, especially ones like Blackwell, but something made her answer honestly. "Music, actually. Piano performance." She regretted the words as soon as they left her mouth. Blackwell's eyes lit up with amusement, and he exchanged glances with his friends. "Piano, how quaint." He took a long sip of his wine, expensive and red. "Tell me, are you any good, or is it just one of those pretty hobbies?" Before Sophie could answer, a server dropped a tray near the kitchen, the crash momentarily drawing everyone's attention. She used the distraction to step away, retreating to the relative safety of the service station. As she helped prepare the main course for Blackwell's table, Sophie glanced at the piano again. She hadn't touched a keyboard in weeks. Her tiny apartment couldn't fit even a digital piano, and her practice time at school had been the first thing to go when she'd had to increase her work hours. The familiar ache of longing twisted in her chest. Some nights, after her shift, she would sit on the bench after the restaurant closed, just looking at the keys without playing, afraid that if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop, afraid of remembering what she was missing. Little did she know that tonight, that piano would become the centerpiece of a moment that would change everything. A moment that was approaching with each passing minute, with each glass that Blackwell emptied, with each whispered comment he made to his friends while watching her move around the restaurant. The night was still young, and Sophie Evans had no idea what was coming. 2 hours into their meal, Blackwell's party had consumed 3 bottles of expensive wine and several rounds of whiskey. The fine food from Chef Paulo's special menu seemed secondary to the alcohol, which flowed freely and loosened tongues and inhibitions with each glass. Sophie maintained her professional demeanor despite the increasingly loud conversation and occasional inappropriate comments directed her way. "Another bottle of the Bordeaux," Blackwell called out as Sophie cleared their dessert plates. His words carried a slight slur now, his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. "Of course, sir," Sophie replied, balancing the stack of dishes carefully. "I'll bring that right out. And be quick about it," one of his associates added with a smirk. "Richard here gets impatient when kept waiting." Sophie nodded and made her way back to the kitchen. The dining room had thinned out considerably as the evening wore on. Most of the early diners had finished their meals and departed, leaving only a handful of tables still occupied. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Just one more hour of her shift remained. "Table 14 wants another bottle of the Chateau Margaux," Sophie told the sommelier, a middle-aged woman named Diane who had worked at Bellini's for over a decade. Diane frowned. "That's their 4th bottle. Are they driving tonight?" "They mentioned a car service earlier," Sophie said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Mr. Chen said they get whatever they want." With a disapproving click of her tongue, Diane went to retrieve the wine. "Just be careful," she warned. "They're getting rowdy and Mr. Big Shot has a reputation." Sophie took a moment to check her other tables. Most were finishing up, signing credit card slips and gathering their belongings. A young couple she'd been serving all evening stopped her as she passed. "We just wanted to say thank you," the woman said with a genuine smile. "Dinner was wonderful, and you made our anniversary really special." "It was my pleasure," Sophie replied, touched by the simple kindness after dealing with Blackwell's table all night. "Happy anniversary." These were the moments that made the job worthwhile, brief connections with people who saw her as a person, not just someone to fetch and carry. As Sophie accepted the signed check with a generous tip, she felt a small surge of gratitude. Every bit helped toward next semester's tuition. The peaceful moment shattered as a burst of raucous laughter erupted from Blackwell's table. Sophie turned to see all 4 men looking in her direction, clearly finding something hilarious. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. Diane appeared with the wine bottle. "Good luck," she said, handing it over with a sympathetic glance. Sophie approached table 14 with practiced poise, the expensive bottle presented correctly in her hands. "Your Chateau Margaux, sir," she said, preparing to open it. "Actually," Blackwell said, waving his hand dismissively, "we've been discussing more interesting forms of entertainment." He turned to face her fully, his expression smug. "Tell me again what you study?" "Piano, wasn't it?" Sophie hesitated, the wine bottle still in her hands. "Yes, sir. When I can." "When you can," Blackwell repeated mockingly. His eyes flickered to the grand piano in the corner, and Sophie felt a chill of premonition. "That's a Steinway, isn't it? Must be worth what, 100,000? "I wouldn't know, sir," Sophie replied carefully. "Oh, I think you would." Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "As a piano student," one of his associates chuckled. "Richard, don't torment the poor girl. I'm not tormenting her. I'm offering her an opportunity." Blackwell's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby tables. "We've paid a small fortune for dinner tonight. I think we deserve some entertainment." Sophie felt her heartbeat quicken. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not paid to entertain. I can ask if the restaurant can arrange for a pianist if you'd like. But why hire someone when we have an aspiring concert pianist right here?" Blackwell stood up suddenly, causing Sophie to take a step back. He gestured grandly toward the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the restaurant at large, "our server has been hiding her talents from us all evening." The remaining diners turned to look, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Sophie felt heat rise to her face as all eyes in the restaurant focused on her. "Mr. Blackwell, please," she said quietly, trying to diffuse the situation. "I'm working." "Yes, you are," he agreed with exaggerated politeness, "and I'm a valued customer requesting special service." He turned to look for Mr. Chen or Raj, raising his voice further. Surely the management would agree that customer satisfaction is paramount. As if summoned by the commotion, Raj appeared at Sophie's side. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes concerned as they darted between Sophie and Blackwell. "Everything is wonderful," Blackwell replied before Sophie could speak. I was just commenting on what a lovely piano you have and how fortunate you are to have a pianist on staff. He gestured toward Sophie. She was just telling us about her musical studies. Raj looked uncomfortable. Sir, Sophie is a server, not our entertainment, but she could be both. Blackwell interrupted, his jovial tone barely masking the command underneath. Just one song. Surely that's not too much to ask after the thousands we've spent here tonight. Sophie saw the calculation in Raj's eyes, weighing the discomfort of one server against the displeasure of a high-spending regular customer. She knew which way it would go before he opened his mouth. Perhaps just one short piece wouldn't be inappropriate, Raj said reluctantly. He turned to Sophie with an apologetic look. If you wouldn't mind. Sophie stood frozen, the wine bottle still clutched in her hands. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her response. She could feel Blackwell's triumphant gaze, already anticipating her humiliation, either from refusing and potentially losing her job, or from attempting to play and failing to meet the standard expected in such an establishment. I haven't practiced in weeks, she said quietly to Raj. I can't just... Oh. Come now, Blackwell interjected. Surely a simple tune is within your capabilities. Unless, of course, you've been exaggerating your talents. The challenge hung in the air between them. One of Blackwell's associates, a slightly younger man with kinder eyes than the rest, looked uncomfortable. Richard, maybe we should let it go. Nonsense, Tom, I'm doing her a favor. Blackwell's voice was firm. Real musicians seize opportunities to perform. Isn't that right? He directed this last question at Sophie, his expression making it clear he expected her to fail. Sophie looked around the restaurant. Several patrons were watching with interest, while others seemed embarrassed by the scene unfolding before them. A few had the decency to look away, pretending to be absorbed in their meals or conversations. In that moment, Sophie thought of her professors at the conservatory, of the hours spent practicing until her fingers ached, of the sacrifices made to pursue her passion. She thought of her father, who had always believed in her talent, who had scraped together money for lessons even when times were tough, who had passed away without seeing her realize her dream. And she thought of Blackwell and men like him, who assumed they could buy and control anything and anyone with their money and status. One piece, she heard herself say, surprising even herself. She handed the wine bottle to Raj, who took it with a startled expression. I'll play one piece. Blackwell's triumphant smile widened. Excellent. Let's all give our server some encouragement, shall we? He began to clap, the sound sharp and mocking in the hushed restaurant. Sophie walked toward the piano, her legs feeling oddly disconnected from her body. The short journey across the restaurant floor seemed to take forever, each step carrying her closer to either humiliation or vindication. She was vaguely aware of Blackwell and his friends turning their chairs to face the piano, settling in for what they assumed would be an amusing spectacle. The grand piano waited silently, its black surface gleaming under the soft lights. Sophie approached it with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend after a long absence. She gently lifted the cover to reveal the keys, pristine white and black, perfectly maintained despite being used only by the weekend musicians the restaurant hired. As she settled onto the bench, adjusting its height with practiced movements, Sophie took a deep breath. The familiar position brought a rush of memory and muscle memory. Her hands hovered over the keys, and for a brief moment she wondered what to play. Something simple and unimpressive to get through the ordeal quickly, or something that would show Blackwell exactly who he had attempted to humiliate. She could hear him making some joke to his companions, their laughter carrying across the room. The sound crystallized something inside her, a determination that had carried her through years of practice, through doubts and financial struggles, through grief and uncertainty. Sophie straightened her back, positioned her hands, and took one more steady breath. The choice was clear. She would play for herself, for her father, for every person who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes hung in the air, a question waiting to be answered. The restaurant fell silent as Sophie's fingers hovered over the keys. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out Blackwell's smug face and the curious stares of the other diners. When she opened them again, she was no longer a waitress in a uniform. She was simply a musician and her instrument, The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated through the air, gentle, questioning, almost tentative. Sophie played the opening bars with a delicate touch, letting the familiar melody wash over her like an old friend's embrace. The piece began simply enough that someone with basic training could manage the introduction, and she could almost feel Blackwell's satisfaction at choosing something that appeared to be at her level. What he couldn't know was that this particular piece had been part of her conservatory audition 3 years ago. She had played it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Her fingers knew every note, every subtle shift in tempo and dynamics. The music lived in her muscles and bones. As the introduction gave way to the main theme, Sophie's hands moved with increasing confidence. The melody sang out sweet and melancholy, filling the restaurant with a sound far richer than the recorded background music that usually played. A few notes in, she heard a glass being set down too quickly at Blackwell's table, the first sign of surprise. The piece began to build, the relatively simple opening transforming into increasingly complex patterns. Sophie's right hand danced across the higher keys while her left provided the foundation, steady and sure. The technical difficulty was escalating with each measure, but her fingers found each note without hesitation. From the corner of her eye, she could see movement as servers paused in their duties. Kitchen staff peered through the doors and remaining diners turned in their seats to watch. Raj stood near the bar, his mouth slightly open in amazement. None of them had ever heard her play. She had never mentioned her training beyond the briefest references when asked about her studies. The music flowed from gentle lyricism to dramatic intensity, Sophie's body swaying slightly with the changing moods of the piece. Her hands stretched to reach difficult intervals, fingers flying in the faster passages with a precision that came from years of disciplined practice. The piano responded to her touch as if they were longtime partners in a dance, the rich tones of the Steinway filling every corner of the restaurant. Sophie allowed herself a glance at Blackwell's table during a brief respite in the music's intensity. His smug smile had vanished completely, replaced by an expression of disbelief. His associates were equally stunned, one leaning forward with elbows on the table, another sitting back with arms crossed but eyes fixed on her hands. The younger one, Tom, was smiling with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. The piece moved into its most technically demanding section, and Sophie surrendered herself completely to the music. Her fingers blurred across the keys in rapid arpeggios and scales that required not just skill, but deep musicality to prevent them from becoming mere displays of technique. Each phrase connected to the next with natural inevitability, the story of the music unfolding as Chopin had intended. As she navigated the complex middle section, Sophie felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the pure joy of making music without constraint. In her tiny apartment with neighbors on all sides, she couldn't play above a whisper. In practice rooms with limited time slots, she was always aware of the clock. But here, now, the music poured out of her unrestrained. The emotional heart of the piece arrived, and Sophie infused it with all the feelings she'd suppressed during her months of working double shifts. The fatigue, the frustration, the delayed dreams, the grief for her father who had believed in her talent so completely. Her body moved with the music now, no longer rigid with nervousness but fluid and expressive. Mr. Chen had appeared from his office, drawn by the unexpected performance. He stood at the back of the dining room, watching with raised eyebrows as one of his servers played with the skill of a professional concert pianist. Next to him, the chef had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his usual hurried demeanor replaced by attentive stillness. The piece built toward its climax, Sophie's left hand providing thunderous low chords while her right hand delivered cascading notes that sparkled like falling water. The dynamic swelled from whispers to powerful fortissimos that showcased the Steinway's magnificent range. The emotional journey of the music was written on her face, concentration, passion, and a touch of defiance. In the final moments of the piece, Sophie glanced again at Blackwell. Gone was the arrogance, the cruel amusement, the certainty of witnessing her humiliation. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable but his eyes never leaving her hands. She held his gaze for just a moment before returning her focus to the music. The final notes arrived, decisive, resolute. The musical question posed at the beginning, now answered with certainty. Sophie's hands delivered the concluding chords with authority, letting the final resonance hang in the air as she slowly lifted her fingers from the keys. Then, silence. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved or spoke. The absence of sound was as powerful as the music had been, a collective moment of stunned appreciation. Then someone began to clap, the young couple celebrating their anniversary. Others joined immediately, the applause spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. Soon everyone was standing, staff and customers alike, their faces showing genuine appreciation and surprise. Sophie remained seated at the piano, her hands now resting in her lap. The moment felt surreal. Months of anonymously serving meals transformed in 6 minutes of music. She felt exposed yet strangely powerful, as if she had reclaimed a part of herself that had been temporarily lost. Mr. Chen approached the piano, clapping with unexpected enthusiasm. "Magnificent," he exclaimed, switching from his usual reserved demeanor to open admiration. "Why didn't you tell us you could play like this?" Sophie smiled slightly. "You hired me to serve food, not to play piano." "A serious oversight on my part," Mr. Chen replied with a chuckle. He gestured around at the applauding crowd. "I think you've found some new admirers." Sophie's eyes found Blackwell, who had not joined in the standing ovation but remained seated, watching her with an intensity that was difficult to interpret. His companions were applauding, even the ones who had laughed at his jokes at her expense earlier. Tom, the youngest of the group, caught her eye and gave her a small nod of respect. As the applause began to fade, Sophie rose from the piano bench. She felt oddly calm, as if the music had washed away the anxiety and humiliation of earlier. She smoothed down her server's uniform and prepared to return to her duties. "I should get back to work," she said to Mr. Chen. "Table 14 is waiting for their wine." Before she could step away from the piano, an older woman approached her. Sophie recognized her as a regular customer who always ordered the same meal and left generous tips. "My dear," the woman said, taking Sophie's hand in both of hers. "That was extraordinary. Where do you study?" "City Conservatory," Sophie replied. "Though I've had to take a break this semester." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I'm on the board there. Helen Miller." She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card. "Call my office tomorrow. We should talk about the scholarship program." Sophie accepted the card with slightly trembling fingers. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller, I will." As Mrs. Miller returned to her table, Sophie felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Raj standing there, the bottle of Bordeaux in his hands and an apologetic expression on his face. "Sophie, I'm sorry about earlier. I had no idea you could play like that." She took the wine bottle from him with a small smile. "It's okay, Raj, neither did they." With the bottle in hand, Sophie walked back toward Blackwell's table. The other diners she passed offered smiles, nods, and murmured compliments. She acknowledged them with brief thanks, but her focus was on the task at hand, completing her job professionally, regardless of what had just transpired. Blackwell watched her approach, his expression now guarded. The atmosphere at the table had shifted dramatically, the boisterous laughter replaced by an awkward silence. Sophie placed the wine bottle on the table and began to open it with practiced movements. "Your Chateau Margaux, sir," she said, her voice steady and professional as she removed the cork with a soft pop. Blackwell cleared his throat. "That was unexpected." Sophie poured a small amount in his glass for approval, her hand steady despite the lingering adrenaline from her performance. "You're full of surprises," he added. Almost reluctantly, Sophie met his eyes directly. "People often are, Mr. Blackwell, when you take the time to really see them." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional before turning her attention to pouring wine for the rest of the table. As she worked, she could feel something had fundamentally changed, not just in how these men perceived her, but in how she perceived herself. The night was far from over, but Sophie Evans had reclaimed something essential. With each note she had played, she had reminded herself, and shown everyone else, exactly who she was beyond the uniform and the role she temporarily filled. And somewhere, in the complicated emotions swirling through the restaurant, a new possibility was taking shape, one that might bridge the gap between the life she was living and the one she had dreamed of. For the remainder of her shift, Sophie moved through the restaurant in a strange new reality. Every table she approached greeted her differently, with smiles of recognition, curious glances, and sometimes even spontaneous applause. Regular customers who had never looked directly at her before now wanted to chat, asking about her music studies and sharing their own childhood piano lessons that had long since been abandoned. Even the kitchen staff treated her differently. When she pushed through the swinging doors to pick up an order, the line cooks gave her thumbs up and Chef Paolo himself emerged from his station to clasp her shoulder briefly. "My daughter studies piano," he told her. His usual gruff demeanor softened. 10 years old. Fights me every day about practicing. He shook his head with a rueful smile. "Tonight I will tell her about you. Maybe it will inspire her." "Thank you, Chef," Sophie replied, touched by this unexpected connection. As the restaurant began to empty, Blackwell's table remained. Their conversation had resumed, but with a markedly different tone. More subdued, less raucous. They ordered coffee and dessert, extending their stay well past the time most diners would have departed. Sophie continued to serve them professionally, neither avoiding their table nor lingering unnecessarily. When she brought their check, Blackwell accepted it without his earlier condescension. As she waited for him to review the total, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're very talented," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him some effort. "Professionally trained, obviously." "Yes, sir." "Thank you," Sophie replied simply. "Why work here, then?" The question came from Tom, the younger associate, his tone genuinely curious rather than mocking. Sophie considered how much to share with these men who had, just hours ago, seen her as nothing more than someone to fetch and carry for their amusement. But something in Tom's expression seemed sincere. "Tuition costs more than talent," she answered with a slight shrug. "I'm saving to go back next semester." Blackwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're not currently enrolled?" "I had to take a break," Sophie said, keeping her voice neutral. "Financial reasons." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. One of the other men cleared his throat and looked away, suddenly very interested in the dessert menu. Tom glanced at Blackwell, something unspoken passing between them. "Well," Blackwell said finally, inserting his credit card into the leather folder. "Thank you for the entertainment this evening. It was unexpected." "You're welcome, Mr. Blackwell," Sophie replied, taking the folder. "I'll be right back with your receipt." As she walked away, she could hear their conversation resume in low tones. She processed the payment at the terminal, noticing with satisfaction that Blackwell had added a substantial tip. Not out of generosity, she suspected, but because his companions would see the amount. Men like him cared deeply about appearances. When she returned with the receipt and card, Blackwell signed it with a flourish and stood to leave. His associates followed suit, gathering their coats and phones. As they prepared to depart, Tom hung back slightly. "Sophie," he said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I wanted to give you this." He handed her a business card similar to the one Mrs. Miller had given her earlier. "I'm on the board of the Philharmonic. We have a young artist program that includes a stipend for promising musicians." Sophie accepted the card, surprised by the second unexpected opportunity of the evening. "Thank you, Mr. Tom," he corrected with a smile. "Just Tom. Give my office a call next week. No promises, but I'd like to hear you play in a proper setting." Before she could respond, Blackwell called from the door. "Tom, car's waiting." Tom gave her a quick nod and joined his colleagues. Sophie watched them leave, the business card a small weight in her pocket that somehow felt significant. As the last customers trickled out, Sophie began her closing duties, refilling salt and pepper shakers, wiping down menus, preparing tables for tomorrow's service. The familiar routine felt oddly comforting after the emotional turbulence of the evening. "You should have told me," Raj said, appearing beside her as she folded napkins. "All this time I had no idea." Sophie continued her methodical folding. It never seemed relevant to serving tables. "Mr. Chen wants to see you in his office before you leave," Raj added, helping her with the napkins. "And he doesn't look upset if you're worried." Sophie nodded, finishing her tasks with particular care. When everything was ready for tomorrow's lunch service, she knocked lightly on Mr. Chen's office door. "Come in," he called. The office was small but meticulously organized, with framed reviews and restaurant awards on the walls. Mr. Chen sat behind his desk, glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the night's receipts. He looked up when Sophie entered. "Ah, Sophie, sit please." He gestured to the chair across from him. Sophie sat, suddenly nervous despite Raj's reassurance. Had she broken some unwritten rule by playing the piano? Would there be consequences for creating a scene regardless of how it turned out? Mr. Chen removed his glasses and studied her for a moment. 6 years ago I came to this country with very little, he began, surprising her with this personal revelation. I had been a respected chef in Taiwan, but here I started washing dishes. He smiled slightly at her expression. Yes, even executive chefs begin somewhere less glamorous. I didn't know, Sophie said. Few do. I don't advertise it. Mr. Chen leaned forward. My point is that I recognize the look of someone working beneath their talents out of necessity. I've worn that expression myself. Sophie felt a flush of embarrassment, wondering if her frustration had been so visible all these months. You're an excellent server, Mr. Chen continued. Reliable professional, but clearly your gifts lie elsewhere. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. This is why I'd like to make you an offer. Sophie's heartbeat quickened. What kind of offer? Our weekend pianist is leaving next month, moving to another city. Mr. Chen slid the paper toward her. 3 nights a week, Friday through Sunday. The pay is better than serving, and the hours would leave your weekdays free for school. Sophie looked down at the paper, a simple contract outlining hours and compensation. The amount listed was indeed significantly more than she made serving tables, even accounting for tips. I don't know what to say, she managed, her mind racing through the implications. With this income, she could re-enroll for spring semester. She could rent a small practice room. She could cut back on her exhausting double shifts. Say yes, Mr. Chen suggested with a rare smile, unless you've received better offers tonight. At her surprised look, he chuckled. I saw Mrs. Miller and that young man from Blackwell's table giving you their cards. I'm not blind. Sophie smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile she'd given all evening. I haven't explored those options yet. Well, mine remains open while you do. Mr. Chen replaced his glasses. Take the weekend to think about it. Now you should go home. It's been quite a night. Sophie thanked him and left the office, her mind swimming with possibilities that hadn't existed just hours before. The restaurant was nearly empty now, just a few staff members finishing their closing duties. The dining room was dimly lit, chairs upturned on tables, the space peaceful in its after-hours quiet. As she passed the piano, Sophie paused. The lid had been closed again, the instrument once more just a piece of elegant furniture. She placed her hand on its polished surface, feeling the lingering warmth of connection. Quite a show, came a voice from the shadows near the bar. Sophie turned, startled to see Blackwell sitting alone at a small table, a single glass of what appeared to be bourbon in front of him. His companions were gone, his coat draped over the chair beside him. I thought you'd left, she said, instantly on guard. Sent the others ahead. Blackwell swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Told the driver to come back for me in 20 minutes. Sophie stood uncertainly by the piano. The rest of the staff was in the kitchen or other parts of the restaurant. She was essentially alone with a man who had tried to humiliate her earlier and who had been drinking steadily all evening. Did you need something else, Mr. Blackwell? She asked, her voice professional but cautious. He studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. Join me for a minute. It wasn't quite a request, but neither was it the imperious command of earlier. Sophie hesitated, then decided that whatever he wanted to say, she would rather hear it and be done with it. She sat, keeping her posture straight and alert. Blackwell took a sip of his drink, then set the glass down deliberately. I misjudged you, he said without preamble. The admission was so unexpected that Sophie didn't immediately respond. I do that sometimes, he continued, his gaze direct but less intimidating than before. Make assumptions about people. Occupational hazard in my business. Why, what business is that? Sophie asked. A faint smile touched his lips. Investments. I find valuable things that others overlook. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table. I'm usually better at it. The irony wasn't lost on Sophie. Perhaps you were looking in the wrong places. Perhaps. Blackwell finished his drink and set the glass down with finality. I wanted to apologize. Now Sophie was truly surprised. Men like Blackwell rarely apologized for anything in her experience. You have real talent, he continued. Exceptional talent, actually. I played a bit in college, enough to recognize the difference between competence and artistry. He paused. What you did tonight was the latter. "Thank you," Sophie said simply, unsure where this conversation was heading. Blackwell reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. "This is for you." Sophie made no move to take it. "I don't understand." "Consider it an investment." His voice had changed, the arrogance replaced by something that sounded almost like respect. No strings attached. Still, she didn't reach for the envelope. "Why would you do that?" Blackwell was silent for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Because 20 years ago I was a very different person with very different dreams." Something in his expression shifted, revealing a glimpse of someone else beneath the polished exterior. "And because sometimes the world needs a reminder that talent deserves recognition, regardless of where it's found." Before Sophie could respond, he stood and collected his coat. "My driver will be waiting." "Good evening, Sophie." He walked out, leaving the envelope on the table between them. Sophie sat motionless, trying to process this final unexpected turn in an evening full of them. Finally, she picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a check with her name on it. The amount written there would cover her tuition for the entire year. 3 months later, Sophie stood backstage at the city's grand concert hall, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the heavy curtain, she could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. Hundreds of people who had come to hear the Philharmonic's quarterly showcase of young talent. 5 minutes. "Miss Evans," the stage manager said, clipboard in hand as he passed by. Sophie nodded, smoothing down the front of her simple black dress, purchased specifically for this evening with a small portion of Blackwell's unexpected gift. The rest of that money sat in her bank account, carefully budgeted for tuition, a decent keyboard for her apartment, and a small emergency fund. She had been tempted to return the check initially, pride wrestling with practicality, but in the end, she had deposited it with a mixture of gratitude and determination to prove his investment worthwhile. So much had changed since that night at Bellini's. She had given her 2 weeks' notice as a server, accepted Mr. Chen's offer to play piano on weekends, and re-enrolled at the conservatory for the spring semester. Mrs. Miller had indeed called her in for an audition for the scholarship program, which now covered half her remaining education costs. And Tom had kept his word about the Young Artists program. Tonight was her first performance with the Philharmonic, not as a soloist, but as part of a showcase featuring 5 promising musicians from around the city. It wasn't a starring role, but it was a legitimate first step into the professional music world. "Nervous?" asked Lynn, a violinist who would perform after her. They had met during rehearsals and formed a quick friendship based on similar backgrounds, both working multiple jobs to pursue their musical dreams. "Terrified," Sophie admitted with a small laugh. "But ready, I think." "You're going to be amazing," Lynn assured her. "I heard you in rehearsal yesterday. The second movement especially, it gave me chills." Before Sophie could respond, the stage manager returned. 2 minutes, Miss Evans. They're finishing the introduction now." Through the curtain, Sophie could hear the artistic director's voice. "Delighted to present a musician of remarkable sensitivity and technical prowess. Please welcome Sophie Evans, performing the second and third movements of Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata." A wave of applause filtered through the heavy fabric. Sophie took a deep breath, squeezed Lynn's hand once for luck, and walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than during rehearsal, momentarily dazzling her. As her eyes adjusted, Sophie made her way to the gleaming concert grand piano at center stage. The instrument was magnificent, a far cry from the upright she had practiced on throughout her childhood, or even the Steinway at Bellini's. This was a piano meant for this space. For this moment, she settled onto the bench, adjusted its height, and took a moment to ground herself. The audience before her was a sea of indistinct faces in the dimmed house lights. But in the front row, she could make out a few familiar figures. Mr. Chen and his wife, Raj and some of the other staff from Bellini's, her piano professor from the conservatory. Tom had attended yesterday's dress rehearsal but had a business trip today. Mrs. Miller sat on the board side, elegant in a blue dress, and there, in an aisle seat near the middle, was a figure Sophie almost didn't recognize at first. Blackwell, sitting alone, his expression attentive and serious. They hadn't spoken since that night when he'd left the envelope. She had sent a thank-you note to his office, formal and sincere, but had received no response. yet here he was. Sophie placed her hands on the keys, clearing her mind of everything except the music waiting to be brought to life. The second movement of the Pathétique began with a gentle singing melody, one of Beethoven's most beloved themes. Her fingers found the notes with practiced ease, drawing out the lyrical quality that had first made her fall in love with the piece years ago. As she played, Sophie was transported back to her childhood living room, where her father had sat beside her on their worn sofa, eyes closed as she practiced this very piece on their second-hand piano. "Music is a gift you give twice," he had told her. "Once to yourself in the joy of playing, and once to anyone lucky enough to hear you." The Adagio cantabile flowed through her, its simple beauty belying the technical control required to balance melody and accompaniment. Sophie shaped each phrase with care, allowing the music to breathe naturally. This movement was like a gentle conversation, intimate despite the grand setting. She could feel the audience leaning in, drawn by Beethoven's masterful writing and her heartfelt interpretation. As the second movement concluded and she transitioned to the livelier third, Sophie caught a glimpse of Blackwell shifting forward slightly in his seat. The final movement required a different energy, playful yet precise, with running passages that sparkled under her fingers. Her months of renewed practice since returning to school were evident in the clarity of each note, each musical idea expressed with conviction. When the final chords resounded through the hall, Sophie held the sustain pedal for just the right duration, before lifting her hands from the keyboard. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air, that magical pause between the end of a performance and the audience's response. When time seemed suspended, then came the applause, warm, enthusiastic, genuine. Sophie rose from the bench and turned to face the audience, bowing as she had been taught. The stage lights made it difficult to see individual faces clearly, but she could feel the positive energy flowing from the hall. This wasn't the stunned surprise of Bellini's diners. This was an audience who had come specifically to hear music and had received exactly what they hoped for. She took a second bow and exited the stage, heart still racing but now with exhilaration rather than nerves. Backstage, Lynn gave her a quick hug before preparing for her own performance. "That was beautiful," her friend whispered. "They loved you." The rest of the showcase passed in a blur. Sophie watched the other performers from the wings, genuinely appreciative of their talents. When all 5 young artists returned to the stage for a final bow, the artistic director presented each with a small bouquet and an enthusiastic handshake. "We hope to see much more of these fine musicians in the future," he told the audience. "Thank you for supporting young artists in our community." After the performance, a small reception was held in the lobby. Sophie found herself surrounded by well-wishers, her professors, fellow students, even a few strangers who had particularly enjoyed her playing. Mr. Chen beamed with proprietary pride, as if her success somehow reflected on Bellini's. "You must play this piece at the restaurant," he insisted. "Our customers would love it." "It might be a bit long for dinner music," Sophie laughed, "but I'll find something similar." As the crowd around her thinned, Sophie spotted Blackwell standing near the exit, apparently preparing to leave without speaking to her. On impulse, she excused herself from her conversation with Mrs. Miller and made her way across the lobby. "Mr. Blackwell," she called. Catching him just before he reached the door, he turned, his expression inscrutable at first, then softening slightly in recognition. "Miss Evans, congratulations on an excellent performance." Thank you," she said. "And thank you for coming. I wasn't expecting to see you here." Blackwell adjusted his coat, a gesture that seemed almost self-conscious. "I was curious to see how my investment was performing," he said. But the words lacked the sharp edge they might have had months ago. Sophie smiled. "And your assessment?" "Exceeding expectations," he replied with unexpected warmth. "Though I suspect that has more to do with the recipient than the investment itself." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Blackwell spoke again. "I never properly apologized for my behavior that night." "You left a rather substantial apology," Sophie pointed out. "Money is easy," he said with a dismissive gesture. "Admitting one's failures of character is harder." He met her eyes directly. "I was